In the history of thought, there are concepts that force us to rethink our usual ideas about human nature and society. One of these is the theory of stupidity proposed by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a prominent German theologian and member of the resistance movement. His reflections on this topic are disquieting and make one wonder what lies behind the commonplace understanding of this phenomenon. Bonhoeffer saw stupidity not simply as a lack of intelligence or an error in judgment, but as a powerful and destructive force that permeates society. Paradoxically, he argued that stupidity posed a far greater danger than evil itself. For while evil can be resisted using reason and moral principles, stupidity is virtually invulnerable to rational influence. According to Bonhoeffer, stupidity manifests itself as active resistance to critical thinking, as a conscious refusal to analyze actions, ideas, and their consequences. A foolish person is unwilling to reflect, doubt, or put his or her beliefs to the test. Unlike evil, which can be curbed through argument and persuasion, stupidity is not intellectually amenable. It stubbornly resists awareness, shows no capacity for self-correction, and does not seek change. Bonhoeffer makes an important distinction between ignorance and stupidity. Ignorance can be the result of a lack of knowledge or experience, and can be overcome through education and enlightenment. Stupidity, on the other hand, is a deeper and more ingrained condition, an unwillingness or inability to accept new ideas, facts, or points of view, even if they are presented convincingly and logically. Ultimately, Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity forces us to consider the nature of human cognition, the limits of rationality, and how social forces can influence our perception of the world. His ideas remain relevant today, reminding us of the need for critical thinking, openness to new knowledge, and a willingness to reconsider our beliefs. Mentally challenged individuals do not just demonstrate a lack of knowledge, they fervently reject the very idea of learning and broadening horizons. They often cling to their unreasonable beliefs, rejecting any intellectual challenge that might force them to face an inconvenient truth. Hence, stupidity is not simply a vacuum of thought, but a willful rejection of critical thinking, which makes it a dangerous and self-replicating force. In this context, stupidity is a far more sinister phenomenon than simple ignorance, as it closes the door to personal growth and new insights. This pernicious way of thinking is most horrifyingly embodied in the historical realities of authoritarian regimes, especially in the heyday of Nazism. Dietrich Bonhoeffer personally witnessed how the passive subjugation of ordinary citizens became the cornerstone of this regime's success. The refusal to critically analyze and question the infallibility of authority allowed the Nazi machine to commit atrocities on a scale difficult to even imagine. The destructive power of this subjugation lay not in the active manifestation of anger, but rather in the lack of resistance on the part of people who had lost their sensitivity to moral and intellectual demands. Helpless people, mired in apathy, were easy prey for ideological processing by the ruling regime, accepting unconditionally its primitive and sinister dogmas. The relationship between power and intellectual limitations is another cornerstone of Bonhoeffer's theory. With power, individuals often lose the capacity for critical analysis and rational thought. The power structure itself facilitates this process by encouraging conformism and suppressing any manifestation of independent thought. The powerful surround themselves with flatterers and sycophants, creating an echo chamber around them that reinforces their prejudices and misconceptions, thus forming a vicious circle of ignorance that is extremely difficult to break. As a result, those in authority lose touch with reality, become immune to alternative viewpoints, and are prone to blind obedience to higher authorities. This pernicious dynamic creates a fertile ground for decisions based on irrationality and incompetence rather than on common sense and open discussion. In this context, stupidity becomes a powerful tool for perpetuating oppression and injustice. The real threat comes not from the malicious intentions of those in power, but from their inability or unwillingness to deal with complex situations, to question their own actions, or to challenge the status quo. Bonhoeffer's paradox thus reveals a disappointing truth. People of shallow minds, especially those in positions of power, can pose a far greater danger than those who act out of malice or bad motives. Their blind obedience to authority, their rejection of critical analysis, and their resistance to intellectual development make them powerful instruments of social and political upheaval. In a world where critical thinking and introspection are increasingly undervalued, Bonhoeffer's ideas serve as a stark reminder of the destructive power of ignorance and the profound effects it can have on society as a whole. Hannah Arendt, an influential German-American political thinker, developed Bonhoeffer's ideas on stupidity by introducing the concept of the banality of evil. According to Arendt, the worst evil in modern society does not necessarily come from the most evil or monstrous individuals, but rather from the ordinariness of those who commit terrible acts without thinking about the consequences. In her analysis of Adolf Eichmann's personality during the Nuremberg trials, the thinker presented a concept that shifts the focus from the innate depravity of the individual to the disturbing ability of ordinary people to become agents of evil through blind obedience and the suppression of critical thinking. In Arendt's view, Eichmann, who was one of the key organizers of the Holocaust, was not particularly evil. He appeared as an ordinary bureaucrat, devoid of moral reflection, who thoughtlessly carried out orders without regard for human suffering. However, the ordinariness of his actions did not absolve him of responsibility. On the contrary, it demonstrated that evil in the modern world can flourish not only in the hands of madmen, but also in the hands of those who are unable to think critically about their role in global systems. Arendt's concept is closely intertwined with Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity, emphasizing the dangers of passivity and conformity in society. Eichmann's mindset is a prime example of blind obedience, fueled by stupidity rather than malice. There was no malice in his actions, rather, it was blind obedience to those above him. Adolf Eichmann's inability to critically evaluate his own actions and think about the consequences demonstrates a profound intellectual and moral stupor resulting from a refusal to think critically. This intellectual apathy, or in other words, stupidity, turned Eichmann into a key figure in one of the most monstrous regimes in history. The banality of stupidity in this context is not limited to Eichmann's personality. Hannah Arendt suggests that modern societies are particularly susceptible to this kind of mindlessness because of the enormous pressure on individuals to conform and submit to authority. Totalitarian regimes, in particular, skillfully exploit this psychological and intellectual inertia. They rely on the inability or unwillingness of the masses to think and reflect for themselves, which creates a favorable ground for propaganda and manipulation. By controlling information flows and simplifying complex issues into primitive binary concepts, such regimes successfully create a population that accepts their actions without question or doubt. The transformation of ordinary people into instruments of tyranny is not due to their malevolence, but to their intellectual inertia and undeveloped ability to critically analyze reality. Hannah Arendt's theory emphasizes that entrenched stupidity, manifested in the form of blind obedience and refusal to think critically, contributes to the consolidation of repressive regimes. An individual's unwillingness to question the actions of the authorities, disregard for moral obligations, and inability to see the consequences of one's actions are all signs of a mindset conducive to tyranny. Arendt's revelation sounds a call to each of us to resist the pressures of conformity, to avoid intellectual stagnation, and to critically evaluate the systems of power that influence our lives. It is a reminder that evil often thrives where deep analysis is lacking, and that our capacity for moral judgment depends directly on our ability to think critically about the world around us and our place in it. In today's world, stupidity sadly manifests itself in the form of mindless acceptance of repressive ideologies and political attitudes. In work environments, political battles, and social justice issues, we often encounter people blindly obeying instructions or adopting primitive views of the world without thinking about the consequences of their actions. This intellectual inertia, often disguised as loyalty or patriotism, is a serious threat to democratic values and human rights. The real challenge is to rouse people from intellectual slumber, to stimulate independent thinking, and to hold power structures accountable to critical and moral scrutiny. Hannah Arendt's theory of the banality of evil serves as a stark reminder that ordinary people, by succumbing to conformity and intellectual passivity, can become instruments of monstrous atrocities. This raises the question, how can we protect ourselves and society from this dangerous tendency? To break out of the vicious circle of ignorance and build a more reasonable and just world, we need to develop critical thinking, self-reflection, and the courage to resist authority and conformity. Bertrand Russell, one of the most prominent thinkers of the 20th century, was deeply concerned about the intellectual climate of his era, especially the disturbing trend in which ignorance was not only forgiven but rewarded, and intelligence, on the contrary, was penalized. In Russell's view, in modern society, stupidity, especially in the political and social spheres, was gaining the upper hand over reason, thereby exerting a decisive influence on the course of history. Russell criticized society for exalting simple, populist ideas instead of complex, rational thinking. This criticism echoes Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Hannah Arendt's warnings about the dangers of stupidity. However, Russell goes further, drawing attention to social structures that do not simply tolerate but actively encourage the triumph of ignorance. One of Russell's main arguments is that modern political and social systems are often arranged in such a way that ignorance is favored while independent and critical thinking is suppressed and punished. In today's world, where complex issues are reduced to brief sound bites and catchy slogans, society faces the danger of making simplistic decisions that do not address the true depth and multifaceted nature of the problems at hand. Russell, a prominent thinker, drew attention to this disturbing trend, especially in the political sphere, where leaders who are able to present easy-to-understand and simplistic stories are often more successful than those who offer deep and comprehensive analysis. The result is a society in which intelligence and rational thought are perceived as a burden, and superficial and simplistic beliefs are elevated to a virtue. This intellectual climate provides fertile ground for the elevation of ignorance over intellect, as people are increasingly attracted to narratives that promise certainty and simplicity rather than confront the uncomfortable complexity of the real world. Russell's analysis also addresses the psychological comfort people find in ignorance. It is often much easier for people to accept simple, black-and-white explanations that provide unambiguous answers to complex questions. Critical thinking, by contrast, can be uncomfortable and demanding, causing people to question established beliefs and seek new perspectives. It requires the courage to face uncertainty, ambiguity, and inner conflict, things that many people try to avoid. The urge for simple solutions, especially when pushed by influential media and political figures, can be almost irresistible. Russell realized that while mental work requires effort and careful analysis of oneself, silliness provides a deceptive sense of security. This preference for cozy stupidity over discomfort-inducing critical thinking helps us understand why ignorance so often trumps knowledge in today's society. This phenomenon becomes even more prominent with the expansion of media and social networking in the 21st century. Russell's observations made in the mid-20th century resonate strikingly in today's media environment, where misinformation and simplification have become commonplace. In the digital age, the rapid dissemination of ideas through social media has led to the formation of information bubbles, where people are exposed only to information that supports their own beliefs. Virtual space contributes to the formation of so-called ideological bubbles, where common sense and critical analysis give way to consensus and groupthink. The incessant flow of misinformation and information noise creates serious obstacles to thoughtful reflection on complex issues. The pervasiveness of intellectual laziness fueled by digital platforms has led to a society in which ignorance is not only forgiven but actively cultivated. In this context, Bertrand Russell's critique in his essay Philosophy and Politics takes on a prophetic tone, as the digital age has only reinforced the trends he warned about. Russell also drew attention to the paradoxical situation in which intelligence and rational thinking in political systems can be perceived as a threat. This is especially noticeable in authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, where the ruling elite prefers to deal with an obedient and uncritically thinking population, rather than with those who question authority and the existing order. Russell argued that the higher the level of intelligence and reflection in a society, the greater the likelihood of conflict between people and the dominant political ideology, which can lead to marginalization and repression. A vicious circle is formed where reason not only loses its value but is actively suppressed, making room for the undivided domination of ignorance. Like Bonhoeffer's analysis of the relationship between stupidity and authoritarianism, Russell emphasizes the key role of intellectual inertia in maintaining repressive regimes. Russell's critique of the triumph of stupidity over intellect sounds a serious warning. The process of elevating ignorance and undermining critical thinking is not a random coincidence, but is purposefully promoted through political institutions, social structures, and the media. The consequences of such a trend can be catastrophic. A society that places stupidity above reason becomes more susceptible to simplistic and dangerous ideologies, ignores pressing problems, and allows political leaders to manipulate the ignorance of the masses. Russell's ideas encourage reflection on the ways in which our society may foster a preference for stupidity and raise the question of the willingness to confront the discomfort of intelligence in order to fight back against the destructive power of ignorance. Education, an unquenchable thirst for knowledge, and the cultivation of critical thinking are tools that can reverse the disturbing trends so evocatively described by Russell. They will help build a society where intelligence, not ignorance, is idolized and encouraged. Stupidity, like an infection, affects not only individuals but society as a whole. Ideas, especially those devoid of rationality, spread lightning fast, gaining strength and support through mere repetition and approval from others. This epidemic of stupidity is insidious because it undermines the capacity for independent thought and critical analysis at the level of society as a whole. The spread of irrational beliefs and simplistic perceptions is not a random process, but the result of a complex interplay of psychological and social factors that encourage conformity, suppress dissent, and create a fertile ground for thoughtlessness. From propaganda to peer pressure, the social structures that promote stupidity are strong and deeply embedded in the public consciousness. The rapid infiltration of ideas into the public consciousness, especially those lacking a solid evidence base or rational grain, is significantly fueled by the powerful arsenal of mass media and ubiquitous social media. In the digital age, information circulates at breakneck speed, but not all information flows are characterized by reliability and depth of analysis. Misinformation, false sensationalism, and simplistic interpretations of events spread lightning fast, often gaining popularity only through repetition. This echo effect creates a deceptive sense of legitimacy and truthfulness, encouraging people to accept such ideas without critically evaluating their validity. In a world where everyone has the ability to broadcast to a wide audience, the line between fact and fiction is blurred, creating serious difficulties for people seeking to separate reality from fiction. In this information environment, independent thinking is eroded by the sheer volume of information demanding attention, causing people to lean toward the simplest and most familiar answers rather than critically analyze complex issues. One of the most dangerous aspects of the phenomenon of social contagion of stupidity is the role that social groups and pressure from others play in reinforcing ignorance. Human nature is arranged in such a way that the desire for socialization and recognition in a society often dominates the need for individual thought. Various social associations, be they political movements, religious communities, or ideological currents, form a specific atmosphere in which certain beliefs and views are perceived as the accepted norm, and dissent or critical analysis is not welcome. This trend is particularly pronounced in polarized societies, where group affiliation is inextricably linked to ideological purity. In such conditions, individuals often refuse to think independently for fear of rejection or isolation by others. The desire to conform to accepted norms and the need for social approval are so strong that people begin to automatically adopt the beliefs and behaviors of their group without critically evaluating them. Over time, this collective way of thinking contributes to the widespread dissemination of simplistic and superficial views of the world, which often have nothing to do with reality. The influence of authority and hierarchical structures on the formation of beliefs plays an equally significant role in the spread of social stupidity. From a young age, humanity is raised to accept the authority of parents, teachers, and politicians without question. In many cultures, obedience to authority is elevated to a virtue, while critical thinking is discouraged, giving way to conformity. This is especially evident in totalitarian states, where any manifestation of dissent is brutally suppressed and the information field is under strict state control. However, even in democratic societies, blind adoration of authority often leads to people mindlessly accepting other people's ideas without bothering to check them. When opinion leaders and experts make statements, especially on complex issues, many people prefer to simply accept their words without analyzing the logic or evidence behind them. This veneration of authority becomes a serious obstacle to independent thinking, creating an atmosphere in which people stop thinking for themselves and rely on others to determine the truth. The danger of the social epidemic of stupidity lies not only in the spread of irrational beliefs, but also in the suppression of intellectual diversity and critical dialogue. In a situation where a uniform acceptance of uncritically understood concepts is asserted within a given society, there is a palpable difficulty in challenging these established notions or offering alternative perspectives. This tendency toward intellectual homogeneity entails the phenomenon of groupthink, in which consensus building and the maintenance of social harmony become the dominant priority at the expense of independent thinking and comprehensive intellectual analysis. As a consequence, society risks sinking into a state where ideas lose their dynamism, discussions become superficial, and progressive development slows down. In such an environment, intellectual inertia becomes the accepted norm, and those who dare to think critically or question the status quo often face exclusion or marginalization. To avoid this kind of social epidemic of stupidity, conscious efforts must be made to counter conformity and cultivate independent thinking. One of the most significant strategies in this direction is the development of an intellectual culture that values questioning, curiosity, and healthy skepticism. Instead of blindly accepting ideas, individuals should develop the ability to critically evaluate the information they encounter, scrutinizing its provenance, logical structure, and evidence base. This requires a determination to leave the comfort of familiar social interactions and engage in dialogue with concepts that challenge established views. It is important to have the courage not to blindly follow the crowd or succumb to the pressures of sameness. The development of critical thinking should be an ongoing process involving constant self-education, reflection, and receptivity to new perspectives. In an age when ignorance can spread at an incredible rate, intellectual tools become vital to protect the ability to think for oneself and to build a more intelligent and insightful society. The social epidemic of stupidity, while a serious threat, is not insurmountable. It can and must be actively resisted. By encouraging critical thinking, embracing intellectual diversity, and questioning authority, people can free themselves from the shackles of collective thinking that fuel ignorance. The spread of irrationality and conformity can be effectively countered through education, open dialogue, and an unwavering commitment to independent thinking. In this way, humanity can regain control of reason and ensure that it is intelligence and deep reflection that will determine the trajectory of civilization. In an era when ignorance, misinformation, and intellectual apathy have reached unprecedented proportions, the quest to escape the vicious cycle of stultification becomes not just an individual task, but an urgent societal necessity. The history of humanity, confirmed by the insights of such eminent thinkers as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Hannah Arendt, and Bertrand Russell, amply demonstrates that collective indulgence in stupidity can lead to catastrophic consequences. However, just as the forces that produce stupidity are social in nature, strategies to counteract them are also rooted in the public sphere. The final section will explore how the ideas of the above thinkers can serve as a solid shield against the pernicious effects of stupidity. The key to success lies in cultivating independent thinking, fostering a commitment to the principles of critical reflection, and creating a society that places intellectual depth above primitive ideologies. Above all, Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity emphasizes the critical importance of ongoing intellectual development. To avoid falling into the insidious net of stupidity, one must devote oneself wholeheartedly to the relentless process of learning and the avid search for truth, even if this path is fraught with discomfort and challenges. Bonhoeffer's denunciation of passivity is particularly relevant today because the pressure to conform to conventional norms and the temptation of easy, superficial answers are at every turn. The most effective way to resist these powerful forces is to constantly stimulate one's own intellect and encourage critical thinking about the world around us. This implies not only an active search for new information, but also a bold questioning of established beliefs and preconceived notions. True intellectual growth is impossible without humility and a willingness to recognize one's own mistakes and misconceptions. In an age where people often seek only information that confirms their own worldview, the courage to embrace complexity and consider opposing viewpoints is more important than ever. Arendt's idea of the banality of evil provides another valuable lesson to prevent falling into the vicious cycle of stupidity: the need for moral and intellectual reflection. Arendt has convincingly shown that one of the greatest dangers in modern society is the willingness of ordinary people to abandon their moral responsibility and intellectual independence in the face of authority and power. To break the vicious circle of mindless existence, it is necessary to reject passive submission and realize ourselves as active creators of morality in the world around us. This implies developing the ability to question any manifestation of authority, to analyze complex concepts in depth, and to take responsibility for the consequences of one's own actions. As Hannah Arendt rightly argued, intellectual laziness and the inability to think critically is not just a personal weakness of the individual, but a serious problem for society as a whole. Consequently, it is the duty of each of us to actively oppose this phenomenon and create conditions in which independent critical thinking can flourish and develop. Bertrand Russell's famous critique of the triumph of stupidity over reason calls us to pay attention to those social systems and structures that deliberately cultivate ignorance. Unfortunately, in many modern societies, intellectual ability is not properly valued, and ignorance, on the contrary, is encouraged, especially in the political sphere. To protect ourselves from the destructive influence of stupidity, it is necessary to recognize and support the intellectual forces that shape our world, and to be vigilant against media, political ideologies, and social institutions that perpetuate simplistic and superficial thinking. Bertrand Russell deeply believed that society often tends to honor those who demonstrate conformity and, conversely, to sanction those who dare to think differently, especially when it comes to issues that are multifaceted and complex. To break the cycle of ignorance, we must cultivate the courage to question conventional wisdom and resist those forces that seek to reduce complex issues to catchy phrases and memorable slogans. Active engagement with the world around us, involving critical analysis rather than mindless absorption of everything on offer, is the first step towards intellectual independence. In today's reality, the media, and especially social media platforms, act as one of the most powerful catalysts in spreading the virus of stupidity in society. It is here that ideas are simplified and distorted, which then spread lightning fast in virtual space. Social media algorithms designed to maximize user engagement often favor content that is emotionally charged and sensational rather than balanced and in-depth discussions. As a result, a favorable environment is created for ignorance to flourish while critical thinking is relegated to the background. In today's world, where information flows in a continuous stream, protecting oneself from intellectual stupor becomes an urgent necessity. This requires cultivating the qualities of a discerning consumer of information. It is important to develop media literacy skills to be able to recognize bias, misinformation, and propaganda, which are often cleverly disguised as truth. By questioning the sources from which we draw information, we can break free from the hypnotic influence of social media echo chambers and seek out more reliable and comprehensive perspectives. Another effective way to counter intellectual stagnation is to create a circle of people around you who are not afraid to challenge established assumptions and stimulate intellectual growth. Social conformism is certainly a powerful force, but we should not forget that our environment has a huge influence on us. By forming networks of like-minded individuals who value critical thinking, diversity of opinion, and intellectual honesty, we create a kind of counterbalance to the social pressures that push conformity. These relationships can provide the intellectual nourishment needed to resist the temptation of groupthink and create an environment conducive to the development of new ideas. In light of the above, it is of paramount importance to establish and maintain relationships with people who stimulate critical thinking, constructive debate, and a thirst for learning. Moreover, intellectual humility must be cultivated to prevent falling into the vicious cycle of ignorance. Humility in thinking allows us to recognize that our knowledge is always incomplete and that learning is continuous. It frees us from the intellectual arrogance that often accompanies self-confidence and encourages a more open and inquisitive engagement with the world. In a society where there is often pressure to appear confident and unwavering in one's beliefs, intellectual modesty becomes a rare but invaluable quality. By developing this quality, we can view the world with greater curiosity, a willingness to learn, and the capacity for personal growth. Ultimately, avoiding the trap of ignorance is not only about resisting external influences, but also about developing inner resilience. It is important to learn to trust our ability to critically analyze and question the information we receive. In today's world, where misinformation spreads at an incredible rate and complex issues are simplified to the point of absurdity, confronting stupidity becomes a particularly difficult but achievable task. humankind can protect itself from its destructive effects and contribute to the formation of a more conscious and reflective society. To do so, it is necessary to constantly test ourselves, not to be afraid to question authority, to develop intellectual modesty, and to create a community of independent thinkers around us. The ideas of such prominent thinkers as Bonhoeffer, Arendt, and Russell represent a powerful strategy for breaking the cycle of ignorance. While the forces that sustain stupidity are significant, they are not insurmountable. A commitment to continuous learning, deep moral reflection, intellectual courage, and social responsibility will protect against this intellectual contagion. Thus, intellectual and critical thinking, as well as moral integrity, will remain key elements both in everyone's personal lives and in the well-being of society as a whole. In the face of pervasive stupidity, it is imperative to become active opponents, thinkers, and researchers striving for a better and more enlightened future. As has become clear from the analysis presented, the phenomenon of stupidity in society is an imposing and insidious force that can influence the political arena, social interactions, and even individual beliefs. However, armed with an understanding of the underlying mechanisms of this phenomenon and drawing on the wisdom of such prominent thinkers as Bonhoeffer, Arendt, and Russell, it is possible to effectively confront intellectual inertia and avoid its pitfalls. It is up to each of us to develop critical thinking, resist conformist pressures, and constantly strive for knowledge to break the cycle of ignorance. If you have found this study useful and are seeking a deeper understanding of the issues involved, don't forget to show your support by clicking the like button and subscribing to the channel. The daily publications are designed to enrich your horizons with valuable insights covering a wide range of relevant topics. For those who are interested in further expanding their intellectual horizon, the description and the attached commentary provide a selection of recommended books that can become a starting point for a fascinating journey into the world of knowledge. An unquenchable thirst for knowledge, active participation, and most importantly, critical thinking. These are the qualities that define a true researcher. See you again, friends. Don't stop asking questions because they are the engine of progress and self-improvement. Continue to grow, strive for new heights, and let your mind always be open to the unknown.